Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're watching on YouTube, you can get more information by going to officehours.global. Our first hour is general discussion, media and virtual production. Whatever questions you might have, we might have an answer. We'll at least have a discussion. The second hour is usually something we want to spend a little bit more time on. Today, we're going to talk about Isadora. Isadora is an automation package oftentimes used in theater for pushing all kinds of crazy stuff up, but we're using it more and more in broadcast. And I'm thinking of running things around the house with it. So it's an incredibly powerful package of automation and kind of a nodal automation controller. So it's pretty exciting. We're going to have a great second hour, so stay tuned for that. Remember that tomorrow is the education hour. We don't stream that. It's 8 o'clock Pacific. But we have a great conversation on Saturday mornings. And then at noon, and the email went out to everyone who's registered, at noon, we have the Belfast Method. We have a stand-up. So it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a different setup. So definitely very, very interesting. Really excited about what we're doing in Belfast from around the world. It's pretty cool. Anyway, let's jump into the questions. Courtney, what do we have next?
All right, Eric Price from Kansas City says there was an interesting discussion on After Hours yesterday on having a second hour on how folks use their Streamdecks. What's the most interesting use panelists have found for theirs?
Go ahead, Doug.
I own like 4 Streamdecks, and I use them for various things in production. One, I have it set up for Unity comms to where I can turn off and on people and talk to each PL channel that I want. I also have a TriCaster that I run shows with a ton of macros, and so I fire the macros with a Stream Deck. And I also have a little tiny guy set up so that if the TriCaster goes down, I'm one button away to switch to vMix as my backup. So Stream Decks are incredibly useful tools, and they are endless in what they can do.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, I was part of this conversation yesterday, and I was all stemmed on a question that was asked yesterday about being able to change other Stream Decks. The big thing that I was talking about, 2 big things, was you don't need to have Companion to make a multi-button option. Stream Deck gives you that option. And the other thing is you could actually change Stream Decks through Stream Decks. So you could have like a 6-button Stream Deck sitting right by your keyboard and mouse, and you could just press a button, and all of a sudden your main Stream Deck, whether it be 15 or 32, could go into a different mode, a different profile, and go from there. And just remember that a 15-button Stream Deck can turn into about 144 buttons options before Companion's even loaded onto this machine, and then you can add to that from there. So there's a ton of stuff you can do.
Go ahead, Chris.
I had a question for Doug. Doug, you mentioned you had your little Stream Deck set up to toggle between the TriCaster and the vMix. Is that button particularly worn out?
Go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, so I use a pair of Stream Decks for my ATEM 2 ME, and I use my left hand on a 32 button and my right hand on a 15. One of the things I like doing is I could change the transition speed. I have a preset for 15 frames, 30 frames, 60 frames, 120 frames. So depending on the mood of the moment, I could transition differently.
That's great. Ari?
So in terms of Stream Deck use, one of the applications is pinning and things like that. But I thought that I'd mention that also use it on other PCs while redirecting the USB with an application that maps it to a different PC, so you can use the same Stream Deck without having to unplug it physically. And I'll put the link to that application in Wakana.
Next question.
All right, next one's coming in from Danny Law in Malaysia. Looking for a room space layout design app that has a decent library of production studio equipment and musical instruments. Any recommendations?
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, so I would recommend a pre-visualizer. There's a couple of ones that are set up for events specifically. One of them I know and have worked on in the past was Vivian, which is a sort of an offshoot of WYSIWYG from Cast Group of companies. I used to work over at Cast, and they had an events planner that's called Vivian. It lets you lay out tables and music and dummies and all of that, and you can render these previs things so that you can then send it to your client and say, hey, this is what this setup's going to look like. This is what this setup's going to look like. It can pull in CAD drawings from Vectorworks and things like that as well. So it's just a nice way, and it gives you a 3D shaded viewport in OpenGL. So it's pretty nice.
Go ahead, John.
Andy just said it. The one we use is Vectorworks, and there's a third-party library specific for musical instruments.
That's great. Next question.
Coming in from Jacob Goodnight in Indianapolis, Indiana. Is there any latency experienced running audio through audio hijack and loopback?
Go ahead, Tlaloc.
So thinking about this relatively, usually the latency is in the video. And so so it may introduce a very small amount of processing latency, but I never see it because there's actually more latency in the video than there is in the audio. And so, for example, with Tony, we on purpose add latency into the chain so that his delay that's coming in through his Lightning to HDMI adapter and into the ATEM can be in sync. His lips and his voice can be in sync. So we actually add some latency in some cases.
Next question.
This one comes in from Ari Block in Tel Aviv, Israel. Andy Carluccio, can you share with us about the high CPU RAM usage on a M1 Mac Mini, the reported memory leak in Zoom, and when there might be a fix?
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, sure. So the Zoom SDK on certain, it's kind of a roulette whether you're going to get this thing or not, but on certain M1 Macs, inside of the Zoom SDK, there is memory leak that over the course of a couple of hours, or depending on the number of outputs that you have, was going to eat up your RAM and your CPU overhead. We reported that issue back to Zoom. They issued a patch to the SDK. We're just validating that SDK now to get it ready. They broke a lot of other things when they provided it back to us, so we're kind of working with them on that. So I'd estimate maybe in 2 or 3 weeks we'll have like a release version of it, but I've already shown Fenwick a beta version of that, and it seems to solve the leak issue. Now, there's other things that we have to discuss about, like what we're learning more about these pluggables and how the M1 interacts with the overhead on rendering the frame from the CPU side of the M1 to get it out there. So we're learning more about how that impacts all of this as well. But in terms of the Zoom issue and the Zoom SDK memory leak, I think we'll be able to incorporate that change into Zoom ISO in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Go ahead, Ari.
But not everybody has it, so it's just something to keep in mind.
Well, thank you, Andy. And I'll just give a shout out to Rotem Kish, who pointed out the issue in the first place. And actually, another just question for Andy. Have we isolated the exact models of Mac Minis that have the problem and those that don't?
So it's not a model specific issue. It's a it seems to be just to be sort of random chance. We've have a bunch of ones that do and don't, and they're the same SKU. So I think it's some issue with the Zoom client communicating with the Zoom server in the window rendering hierarchy, and I think it's just random. So we haven't been able to replicate it internally necessarily, but we have a patch and we showed it to Chris, who was experiencing it, and it seemed to resolve that part of the issue. So I'm optimistic.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah, the RAM leak was definitely fixed, and like Andy said, there's a few other things to deal with. I suspect that the display link patch, whatever, is the culprit when it comes to the CPU usage. I think probably it's working pretty hard. I don't know for certain, but like Andy said, different machines of the same model are behaving differently, which is curious, and we're trying to get to it.
Next question.
All right, our next one up is from Mike Emmett in Melbourne, Australia. I'd love some ideas from the panel for the kinds of small events that businesses can run to engage their customers. I'm very familiar with the wine, beer and spirits industry, but am asked to extend ideas into other areas.
Go ahead, Vienna.
So I can speak from the health industry. I've met a number of health and machinery representatives. So for example, if you're looking at a certain equipment for fitness, or if you're looking at a machine that you run in an operating theatre, then you want it to be as high fidelity as possible. So especially if it's live and you've got people tuning in on Zoom, then they want to be able to feel what it's like to use that product. Or they want to hear stories of people who have used that product and how it compares to other products. So something, if you can, like a simulation, or get someone your end to actually try it out, a layman who doesn't know how to use it in the first place. And I think that would engage customers well by sort of bringing them in and not starting at such a high level that they have no idea what you're talking about. So I guess that's how you could do it. Just make it high fidelity.
Go ahead, Sky.
We're bringing the entertainment concept to this conversation, and Kyle and I are working on that Hour of Happy concept. But about the mixology, what we are also trying to do, and I think you and I would discuss this here in the United States, is how can we get that specific brand into the hands of the customers? And so that's why we're working at not shipping things ourselves, but trying to partner with distributors in the different regions so that we don't cross, we don't start shipping liquor across state lines.
I will say in the wine and spirits area, we've done a fair number of tastings where we actually did just ship out, into the states that were available, that we could do that. We'd ship out a bottle of wine with some cheese. And what we did is we had them, and we talked about this in After Hours a little bit, but we would have the wineries would join the conversation, and the folks making the cheese would join the conversation. And so you get to see how it was made, and the vats and the storage and the thing, and it was incredible while you're sitting there tasting your wine from home. And it was one of the coolest things that we had done. We only did probably 4 or 5 of them, in the course of a couple of years. But every time we did it, we were like, we should be doing this all the time. It's just amazing. We did another one with whiskey as well, where we, were at the distillery and giving people tours while they have a little bit of whiskey. And so in that area, it's actually really powerful. But I think that the primary thing is you got to think about what your audience wants to know. Like, what are they interested in? It doesn't have to be your product. It just has to be people that like this, probably like a lot of these other things, and figure out what adventures you can take them on that there's a high crossover in that area. And the other thing to think about is that we all often think about things in events as a one-time thing. And I think that the future is really over and over and over again. And you have to be patient. I think we might have talked about this yesterday, but just go into TikTok and look at the bottom of the list. Like, go to someone who's got 1 million followers and look at the very beginning, and you'll see lots of, 3 people watching, 10 people watching, 10 likes, 3 likes, 30 likes. There's like 60 failures, in there, for a TikToker that has millions of followers now. And that's part of the winnowing of the viewership. So you have to know that really to be successful, and I think that something we found here is doing it over and over again. Maybe not every day, but at least every month or every week, people know that they can do it. And when they find out that they can interact, when they find out that they can actually talk to you and get their questions answered, it's a big deal. It's much more engaging. Next question.
All right, this one is coming in from frequent contributor Douglas Carmichael. What issues do you have to be aware of when lighting a stage for cameras versus a live audience?
Tlaloc?
Okay, so this is starting to change with high dynamic range, but the eye and the camera have a very different dynamic range, and it is and that matters in both directions. We want to give the camera enough light across the board to see everything and not go dark into the shadows or high into the highlights and mess with the image. For the eye, it's actually quite a bit less interesting when you do that. You want to give the eye enough dynamic range to have interest and to pull things forward. And so you have to ride that knife edge when you're working for both the eye and the camera, so that you can have interest for the camera and interest for the eye. Or you decide whether or not your camera first or your eye first, and you make a decision about that, and then you light for that. So now, as we get closer to As those two things come closer together with high dynamic range and really, really good color rendering within lights, within lights, but also within cameras, we're going to get closer to those, to that vector. That delta is going to start to go away. But we also have to learn how to do it for the camera again. We have to learn how far we can go and how where that's weird, because we've gotten used to a particular kind of dynamic range in our broadcast eye.
George? Is George here?
I took my hand down, actually.
Okay. Go ahead, Vienna.
So white lights are all the same white, and stage lights are usually white. So if you're going to use a camera, and if you're going to use multiple cameras especially, then it's important to light the entire stage consistently, and ideally with a white light, so that it's easy to white balance later on in post, as opposed to using coloured lights on a stage, which is better for an audience because it's fun and exciting, and you don't have to worry about balancing it for post because you're not filming it or photographing it. So it's a matter of white lights versus coloured lights and the consistency of lighting.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Well, this is a fun topic, and I've had plenty of experience doing it as well. Firstly, lighting for any live audience, the first thing you want to think about with your camera is where you're running your cables so that people, A, don't stand on them and damage them, and B, can't trip over them and cause you an insurance issue.
All right.
Right. When you're looking at some of the cameras that have been available in the past, up until really the A7S series came out from Sony, doing this sort of filming in a stage environment was difficult, simply because the amount of light that a lighting director for a theatre company wants to use is a lot lower than what a camera needs. So you are looking at getting a high ISO camera. The A7Ss, the brand new Pentax K3 Mark III is another, or KP, are good cameras for low lighting. Just be aware of one of the sneaky little things with all of these H.264 base codec cameras. The data bandwidth that you've got is per second, not per frame. So if you can attach an external recorder and use that, then you will get a better quality image for your post-production, because you are going to need to adjust it. Again, it's the stage director will take priority over anything you do for your camera. It's always going to be a compromising camera.
Tlaloc?
Sorry, I just wanted to come back in really quickly and talk about color and what Vienna was talking about. When you're lighting for the eye, you have to think about white balance as well, because if you have a bunch of different colors in the room, the highest amount of color will be where your eye starts to white balance. So if you have mostly saturated blue, your eye will make that white, and you will actually get a headache from it. And so you have to be really careful about giving people some time to reset. And so what we call that a reference white, because the eye has a way better auto white balancing. The brain actually has a way better auto white balancing methodology than a camera does. So you have to think about white balancing in all of those scenarios.
Absolutely. And, we work in a lot, I do a lot of work in HDR, and it's changing everything about how we think about how these things work and where we put lights and how to create detail in the shadows, and allowing ourselves to have peak lights that used to blow out are now this rich detail that we have. We can see the filaments in them when it used to just be a white ball, and so there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening. The hard part we get into is that we still have to go back to standard dynamic range. So we have to figure out how we're going to tone map that. So when basically the HDR, it looks great, and then we have to do what's called tone mapping, which is how do we remap everything from that was, full HDR, and what they quote unquote consider, full range is 10,000 nits, and that's not really full range, but it's what we kind of talk about. The brightest TVs really available right now are 4,000 nits, and they're very expensive. And really you're living in the 1,500 to 2,000 range for most of those. That's HDR or some version of HDR, Vision or HDR10 or HLG. Standard dynamic range by comparison is 100. so it's a very, very small slice of what we have there. All right, next question.
All right, next one comes in from sometime panelist here, David Brady in New York, Windows 10 Home Edition. I need to sandbox a few apps, but the native Microsoft Sandbox is not available. Are there any other free or inexpensive options?
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, Sandbox is not available on Windows 10 Home because there are certain features that Home doesn't have that you need to have Pro. Now, the cool thing about this is you could actually, and it depends on if your laptop can do this, get yourself a hard drive, plug the hard drive in, and then set it up to actually and load Windows 10 Pro onto that extra hard drive. Now, the cool thing about that is usually after 30 days, you're probably used to the whole idea that it says you have to register. But with Windows 10 Pro, they've been doing it where you basically get a little watermark on the bottom corner, but it won't stop using your Windows. You could still use it for things as testing. So then you basically would just boot into that version of Windows and do your sandboxing from there.
Next question.
Okay, this one comes in from Noah Sargent in Fullerton. Karl and friends, can you summarize what you've seen and heard about the Panasonic and MFT servo lenses? Micro Four Thirds.
Go ahead, Vienna.
So I'm not Karl, but I'm a friend, and Karl's been speaking to me about this. So
this is hearsay. Technically, I just want to tell the jury this is hearsay. You should not take this as testimony. But we'll go ahead and let the witness continue to talk.
We'll allow it.
We'll allow it.
Thank you very much. He did say friends, so I'm just on. So with the Panasonic, the Panasonic MTF servo lenses, we don't know very much technically, but we can compare it to the Canon Compact Cine servo lenses, so the 18 to 80 and the 70 to 200, and they foreshadow where Panasonic will go, which is more cinematic lenses. They'll still make photographic lenses, but they're sort of going into the direction of we're going to make it cinematic lenses that can be compatible with Blackmagic cameras.
It's really, really interesting. I mean, I think that really what we're seeing now is that Blackmagic's market share has gotten so large that people are now building stuff for it. But when Panasonic is building lenses for your cameras, you've reached a new level. Next question.
All right, this one should open up a Pandora's box, again from Noah Sargent in Fullerton. What is your greatest failure in the business, and what did you learn?
Go ahead, Doug.
I don't know if it's a greatest failure, but it's been a struggle starting a business from scratch. We've been in business 11 years, and I think one of the biggest struggles is just running the business itself as a business, and not devaluing what we do. And because video production to me is a passion, so I just love doing the work, and I do it for free, but I need to get paid for it if I'm going to stay as a business. So I would probably say the devaluing myself, and then that struggle from, all right, I need to really focus on being a business, and then setting a standard early on, and working at this level but getting paid for this, so right. That's probably one of my biggest struggles, and I continue to still struggle with that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Stuart.
Getting sucked into buying a wedding video business by people who are running 2 sets of books.
There you go. That'll do it. Yeah.
Yep, that ruined it. And when somebody comes to you to sell their business to you, get an accountant.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Some years ago, when I started a business, I was lucky enough to be very successful very quickly. But the real gotcha was how to run a business that's successful over the long period. And that's where I got sort of caught up, because I just wasn't prepared to deal with the minutia and the detail that it required to run an ongoing business. I was excited about starting it, but I wasn't quite so excited about running it. And then the second part of that gotcha was that I found myself doing more to support everybody else, and I was doing less and less of what I was good at and less of what I enjoyed doing in the business. So that disappointment made me to be less of a good business owner. Yeah. So be careful. Those are gotchas.
Tlaloc?
So we talk a lot about not changing things when we're getting closer to production, and that is something that we in the theater business ride the knife edge of all the time, because we're working with way too little time and we're trying to get a lot done. Super huge ambition, tiny time. But when I first started in the lighting business, I was really excited about being really good at what I was doing, and I wanted to go in and change the programming so it was really nice on the back end, and no one would know. Like I would know that it was super clean. So on opening night, I went in and made a bunch of changes, and then went, oh, I think I have a logical error here. So let me just reset. So I reset back to the previous to the previous save, and it changed. In moving lights, you have pan and tilt, and you can tell the pan and tilt to reverse so that it's easier to control them. It removed all of those pan tilt reverses, and I lit like one of the biggest donors in the theater for the entire first act of the show. And so what I learned from that is I needed to fess up when I made a huge mistake, because that was a huge mistake, and I needed to never do it again. So yeah.
Ari.
So my undiagnosed dyslexia or ADHD or whatever caused me to skip the as in the business, and I thought this was a general business question, so I'll answer and offer this. I spent over a decade in India, most of those years setting up a business trying to revolutionize some aspect of the petroleum industry and the retail. It was a failure in the sense that we didn't meet our business objectives as well as the monetary loss. And what I learned was, first of all, we didn't raise enough money. These are like classical, startup stuff, but we didn't raise enough money. All the money we raised was from a single investor. Not a good idea. Not pulling the plug sooner, and allowing feature creep in technology sort of to keep the false faith alive and drive the agenda. And again, we should have cut that sooner. So those are my takeaways.
Vienna.
I'm going to speak from a business perspective as a photographer and from the talent side. So for both of them, not starting earlier could be considered a failure, because I've had such great experiences being a photographer, and I've made friends, and I've learned a lot about myself and developed skills from that. And I just wish I started earlier. And from the talent side, as a public speaker and someone who presents, I would say I wish I kept in contact with the people who got me into the industry and networked with them consistently, because it goes a long way to honor the people who have helped you, and this goes for a lot of other industries as well. So I would say that remembering to just know where your roots are and who's helped you out, and thanking them.
Courtney?
My biggest mistake was forming a business with two other partners, because if you're equal partners in a three-way business, sooner or later, two of them are going to get together and vote you out and steal the business, take it over. And that was my biggest failure. And from then on, I've had no partners.
Go ahead, Chris.
I will yield my time.
Ken?
Yeah, it was interesting, this one. I wasn't thinking whether I was going to answer it or not. One of the big ones was when I started going freelance and trying to do everything yourself, and not was one of the biggest failures. You're trying to do too much, and because you think, well, I know how to do all of these bits,
right?
But really, yeah, look for help, look for good other people to work with, good to partner with. So then you can focus on what you're really good at and manage the rest.
Jeffrey?
For me, it was trusting my gut. I had an event where they came in, they said, hey, we want you to do some live streams. And I said, that's great. We worked out all the details. And then as the event kept coming, more people started coming in and starting asking the same questions and doing the same thing, and say, well, what if we do this? Or what if we do this? And they weren't doing the things that I needed them to do. Like, for instance, getting me internet to do the live stream. So at one point I started saying, you know, this is probably going to be too much for me. I'm gonna pull out. And they kept saying, no, this is gonna be fine. This is gonna be fine. We want you to come. We want you to come do it. We want you to come do it. Well, I did go do it. We did have a lot of failure. The Wi-Fi was the big issue, or the wireless or the internet was the big issue, because I had to go over Wi-Fi. And what came out of it was a group of people that probably will never work with me again, simply because of the fact that I let them say, okay, no, this is all going to be good. This is all going to be good. Instead of me saying, cutting it off there, I probably would have still had a relationship with that company.
My biggest failure, of course, is that I dumped my company into the ground.